Okay. No? Okay. Sorry, there's a slight glitch. We're starting again. Thank you to everybody who's tuning into this. I'm Alison Gillmor from the Winnipeg Free Press, and tonight we're talking about using design to navigate the pandemic. And part of that, of course, is involved using new formats, new technologies. So thank you for everyone for bearing with us. Thank you to First Fridays for continuing to support connections between our artists and our city. And thank you to an instructor at the U of M and an urban designer at Sputnik Architecture, and also a practicing visual artist who has written extensively on the interface between urbanism and design and media. I want to also tell everyone that you can submit questions that we can respond to. You can just type questions in the YouTube chat window, which will be located either to the right or below. And now I guess we'll start talking. So I think architecture is about how we interact with space, how we interact with each other, how we feel at home in the world. And I think the pandemic has made us very aware of all those things. The pandemic also seems to, I think, threaten all those things, but it also seems to offer a lot of possibilities for a way forward, a kind of reset. And the architect Hashim Sarkis has said in an interview during the pandemic, he said, as architects, we are condemned to optimism. So I like that idea. So I guess we'll keep that at the forefront of our talk. So, and I think maybe what we could start with is talking a little bit about history, because I think it's always good to remember that what we are experiencing has happened before, or at least aspects of it have. So I think we just want to look at the fact that disease and the fear of disease have always influenced design and architecture and city planning, and sometimes in ways that we now just take for granted. We don't see the roots of where these things came from, but they often came from the kind of trauma we're experiencing now. So let's look at the Haussmannization of Paris to start with. Lawrence, do you want to talk a bit about this?
Sure. The 19th century was a time when Europe began to sort of explode in terms of population, development, industry, and a result was that cities started to become really huge, and conditions became very bad. In the 1840s, there was a pandemic, a cholera outbreak in Paris, and partly in response to that, Napoleon III got a prefect called Haussmann to redesign Paris, which basically meant gutting it. You probably have a picture in your head of actually, Colby, if we could go on to the image of Paris, the next slide along. That's right. So you see there, one of the great streets that was carved through the slums of Paris as a way of sort of cleaning out the city. And this is known as the Haussmannization, after the guy who sort of invented it, the urban designer, bureaucrat who created it. So it was all about dealing with disease, cleaning up the city. It wasn't just in Paris, but projects like this went on sort of through the world, or at least in Europe. So, and another example would be the Embankment in London. Again, cholera was an issue in London also. And anyone who's been to London has wandered along the north bank of the Thames, a beautiful promenade, maybe not realizing that that is a sewer, because the Thames was originally used as a sewer. And because conditions got so bad due to that, an engineer called Basil Jette built this immense sewer, and it became the Embankment along the Thames. So basically diverting, cleaning up the city, dealing with disease through design.
Yeah. And that's, it's so hidden in a sense, because as you say, it's this lovely promenade and people walk along it and it looks beautiful.
Sure.
But it has this function that is rooted in the 19th century response to disease.
Yeah.
And then also in the 19th century, we have the public park system, and those kind of large often centrally located parks, like Central Park in New York is kind of the big example, but also we have a Central Park here in Winnipeg. And they were sometimes called the city's lungs or breathing centers. And I think it was very much tied into this notion that urban life was unhealthy and caused degeneration, which is a big 19th century notion, physical degeneration, moral degeneration, spiritual degeneration, and that these parks were a way to sort of reset and refresh. And they were seen very much as a place of health that helped to counteract the sort of crowded, dirty, overwhelmed cities.
Yeah. This became the impetus for a lot of modern thinking about architecture, actually, beyond the 19th century. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I could throw a comment in there, Alison, and thanks for having me in this discussion. Regarding the Haussmann image of the boulevard cutting through the city, I mean, of course, we need to bear in mind that, this was referred to as the sanitary reforms. And, we're used to hand sanitizer. The word sanitization has become kind of sanitized in itself. We always want to be a little cautious with movements of such scale that are setting out to sanitize the city. Because what are they sanitizing the city of? There were people living in crowded conditions, which are part being sanitized, removed, evicted, right? And the 1950s, or the 1850s, the Haussmann renovation of Paris, it's also coming on the heels of the 1848 French Revolution, where we know from, for the barricades, of course. So the revolution, they thrived in these tight confines of the city and built barricades in the narrow streets. And that's part of what's being eradicated. So it's to some extent, I mean, there's certainly positive health benefits that came out of this, for sure. But we always have to look at the other side of the social renovation, which is also happening concurrently with the physical renovation of the city.
Yes, exactly. And I think we'll talk about that even more later when we talk about what controls might be coming in on the heels of sort of COVID policing, in a sense. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I love the visual that Lawrence chose, because I think sometimes when you're on the boulevard, you're thinking, wow, boulevard, it's great. But then when you see it from the aerial view, you just see how it just absolutely cuts through these communities and neighborhoods. And, it's a very interesting, So, and now let's talk about another Manitoba example of a larger movement, and this is as a response to TB, which was and still is actually a worldwide killer. And in the early 20th century in Canada, the only proposed cure for TB was rest, nourishing food, and fresh air, lots of fresh air. So we have the Ninette Sanatorium. And you have these wraparound screened airing porches, and you'd sit in your cure chair, which is kind of a prototype in a sense for this sort of modern recliner that you can move around. And that's a kind of, I think that's a good example of design that was responding to a very specific disease, but has a kind of an afterlife, because I mean, really, if you live in Manitoba, why wouldn't you want to wrap around screened porch? I mean, it's a great idea, actually, for all sorts of reasons, even though tuberculosis is now cured by drugs. And then I guess let's talk about modernism a bit. Do you want to lead off on this one, Lisa? Looking at Richard Neutra, whose father died in the second wave of the 1918 influenza pandemic, and he built this what's sometimes called the health house, which makes it clear what the architecture is all about.
Right, and sure. Can you hear me at this moment? I'm
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I don't know if I have too much to say on Neutra exactly. I mean, certainly the configurations of these homes were oriented to health and well-being, and things like dance and educational movements, also women's liberation movements were very important. So this kind of free-flowing space and the free-flowing air that moved through that space, there was a whole sense of liberation in general that's coming along with that, and women's liberation is one of the things going on at the time. But there's also Neutra, of course, was a colleague of Adolf Loos in Vienna before he was a student of Loos before he came to America. And Adolf Loos is one of the early proponents of the whitewashed walls.
Yes.
But with that as well, there's also a kind of liberation of an inherited class system, you know, and aristocracy and ornamentation, which was presumed to be a part of one's class. You know, you could tell how wealthy one was by the ruffle of their collar or by the size of their cornice. And so for sure, health orientations are related to the modernist movement, but so too is a whole kind of democratization of space, of architecture, as not just catering to the privileged, but thinking about it in more of the populace. And certainly that there's a desire not to be showy about it, and the ornamentation is part of that show, which is internalized in the Adolf Loos projects and removed more in the Neutra. But Lawrence, you probably have something to say on this as well.
Just that it's, again, just to reiterate, it's about sort of a kind of a purification of the past in a way. Like you're mentioning ornament, that's part of the old the trappings of aristocracy and of social divisions that the early modernists kind of idealistically believed, we can leave all that behind, worker housing, mass housing, and it's all about steel and it's all about glass, with a sort of a minimization of any sort of decoration. Because decoration, in a way, is, there's the famous expression of ornament is sin, right? Ornament might also be seen as disease, because it's something that sort of spreads over everything. So that this is, again, there's a kind of a confluence of the idea of healthiness and purification of things, and the clean, simple designs of modern architecture.
I think that the kind of notion of purity and the disgust at ornament functions on a lot of levels. And that's true. There is a kind of practical idea that all that ornament, it traps dust and it traps really.
It's about pollution.
And it's, exactly. And if you have this house that has it purifying sunlight streaming in, if you have the air moving through it, if you have porches where you can sunbathe or flat roofs where you can sunbathe, and everything is, easy to clean. So there's all sorts of levels of purity, but I think it is a kind of reaction to this fear of disease, and also, moral disease too, maybe. Okay, well, that's, and then Neutra, just because we're all thinking about children going back to school. It's interesting that he designed this sort of experimental school with these glass walls that could actually kind of retract, and so that you get tons of fresh air coming in. And again, this is the notion of sort of healthful education, healthful in very many ways. And it just weirdly that it's called the Corona School. It's a little on the nose, as they say.
There's another famous school by Jan Duiker in Amsterdam called the Open Air School from the 1930s, and it's a multi-story school, or oriented around a courtyard and very large windows that open, and that too, like it's also related to the the resistance to learning as indoctrination.
Right.
So there's a kind of giving of agency to the young students to be active in their learning, and it doesn't always just come from the teacher. So
that's right, and that it's connecting to nature and the outer world, maybe. Yeah. Now moving on to some sort of, I guess, big ideas going forward. There's this striking image of Wuhan under the lockdown, which I remember seeing that early on and thinking it looked like a sci-fi movie, like all those kind of post-apocalyptic sci-fi movies. And it's terrifying in one way, but I think it also seems to offer us this moment to think about, what we want from our cities and what we want from our houses, and what could change and what has to change actually going forward. So do you think the pandemic will be sort of an accelerant in some ways to trends that are already underway?
I would say, first of all, we don't know what's going to happen, and that's kind of fascinating to wait and find out. But I would, my take on it would be yes. And actually, that image is a really interesting one because it sort of encapsulates the tale, like that 19th century, let's rip out the old heart of the city and let's build roads through it. And then the 20th century, let's build these immense boulevards or highways for cars. Let's throw up buildings, sky high. In a way that sort of encapsulates that whole movement, and also it's reminiscent of scenes from a post-apocalyptic or a zombie film or something like that, which almost seem to be like a criticism of that whole approach. And in a nutshell, I mean, what urbanism has been moving towards since about the 1960s or 70s is something other than that model. And I guess we could talk about the ways that perhaps COVID, why did this happen in a city like this? What is the connection between COVID and the sort of rampant overdevelopment of the world? But what is really being called for almost by the earth is a kind of a reset, rethinking of things. I don't know what Lisa's take would be.
Well, maybe first just an anecdote. I have a former thesis student from Wuhan, and I think in February, when the headlines around Wuhan were big, I reached out to her and I said, I hope you and your family are fine. And she sent me an email back saying, oh yeah, that's on the other side of Wuhan.
Sure.
So she felt at that point she was quite protected. It is
sure.
a humongous city, and actually they took some strategic actions and brought it under control better than some other places. Regarding, will COVID be an accelerant for some things already underway? I hope so, and I think that's the case. Even though we do not know what's going to happen, we never do. We do want to be aware of. We don't want to accelerate all the things that are bad. We want to accelerate the things that are good. So the things that are already underway, which I hope will be accelerated, are things like more sustainable buildings. This has been a top priority for years, and there have been major improvements to the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems of building to make sure that fresher air is coming to people. So in our hydro building is a great example of that. So these are standards that lots of research has been underway. I think there will be a higher demand for scrutiny of indoor air quality going forward. So that's something, let's make it happen. Things like accessibility and universal design. This has been law for, is it 30 years now? They just had the ADA anniversary in the States. Touchless technologies. This is great. Let's make sure they're being implemented for the sake of human rights and not just because it's the latest technological gizmo. Let's make sure it's in service of universal accessibility. And also things like social equity in general and different modalities of work, less stressful conditions, attention to wellness, employers creating policies for well-being. Now it's opened up. We have a model. There's a lot of places we're already allowing some employees to work at home. Now this has been opened up as a model to be considered and adopted as policy in some workplaces. But then at the same time, by the mode of our communication right now, the tech giants are also accelerating. And I think this is something that we want to be alert to. Yeah.
That'll makes a great deal of sense. Should we talk just, I guess, about that 1 month we experienced of Winnipeg with no cars, which was a really interesting, not entirely without cars, obviously, but certainly the street near my house became a kind of impromptu pedestrian walkway. People promenaded, like whole families after dinner. It felt very European, and dogs and bicycles, and that was a road which usually had cars whizzing down it. So, and I think a lot of neighborhoods had that, and people really liked it, right? So, do we want to look at like just a shot of Wolseley and people walking?
Sure. I think that's what we have up on the screen right now. I mean, yeah, it was an opportunity to inhabit the street in a way different than what we're used to. Usually you are not in there because there's cars there, right? Yeah. But it just simply being able to do that every day, any time of day, made me, I live in this neighborhood, made me think and basically come to the conclusion that, like, why is it not like this all of the time? Because do we really have to drive down this street? It's so good for walking and bicycling, dog walking, and so et cetera, et cetera. And there, you could sense a real hunger for people who were trapped in their houses and had to get out somewhere. And it really, makes us rethink why we give up all of our streets to cars, because it's not like that in all parts of the world.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and I would just reinforce that. I mean, I'm someone who lives in Winnipeg without a vehicle all the time. But I've definitely been going for more walks than I ever have before. And I have noticed a lot of people appropriating the outdoor spaces in the Exchange District in ways I haven't always seen them being used. So for families playing Frisbee, and it's wonderful. And small gardens are important for everyone right now, as well as large infrastructural greenways, interconnected pedestrian and cycling spaces.
Right. And Lisa, you were talking about, I think what you called happy accidents, and just, the experience of random encounters and things that you see when you're out in the city. And so how do you think public space and public art, and they've obviously become more important, and how can we bring people together for those very important civilizing kind of urban interactions, when certain kinds of other gatherings are impossible? And is there a way for design to sort of help facilitate that?
Yeah, good question. I mean, for sure there is. I mean, improvisation is a mode of artistic production. So I think there have been, and there still will be, many artistic responses to this. The arts need to be supported, of course. And Senator Bovey, who's from Winnipeg, I know has been very proactive in supporting the arts and advocating for support to government. But I know that right now, like Synonym is painting the parking garage. They're doing murals at the Forks. So that's something to go see. So I think the mural work is important. Public displays, public performances. I know the Fringe Festival is struggling, as are many performing arts. But Lawrence, I also know that you are doing public art pieces in our
Sure, it hasn't ended.
challenges.
In fact, Manitoba Arts Council has started a series of micro grants to support installations. And I saw some really interesting work by a lighting designer and media artist, Hugh Conacher, projecting the interior of his house, everyday life, onto the exterior of his house, making a private space public. So there is a lot going on out there. I guess I'd just like to come back to the idea that this idea of bumping up against people who are different from yourself is the fundamental urban experience, right? Yeah. And that requires opening up streets so people can walk there. It requires people being in the same space together. So I guess one challenge, and that's kind of the basis of what has now become conventional thinking in urban design, that it's good to have people doing this. COVID is a challenge to that, right? Because if we're all supposed to be keeping distant from each other, then how do we square that with the idea that we should be close together? There is an argument that, now this proves we should all be living in suburbs. Because it's cleaner, and I guess that's part of the idea behind those. But there are challenges to that interpretation also. I don't know. I'd be interested to know what you guys think about that. That if we want to be living close to other people and exchanging ideas with other people and propinquity, being in the same space. How do we square that with the fact that we're now supposed to keep distant from each other? Do we have to? Is media the only way we can do that?
I hope not. Yeah, and I mean, it looks like there is. This is also kind of. It's hard to say what we're going to know, a month from now or 2 months from now. But there does seem to be some data coming out. I just saw another article today suggesting that density alone is not necessarily a predictor, like poverty.
Yeah.
Poverty, people who are in high risk work. Which we call essential work, but don't usually pay if it's essential work. That is often a bigger risk factor. So hopefully there won't be a kind of flight to the suburbs. And then, one of the other issues of public space seems to me like if people are getting together, in public space to meet safely with other people outside, so if we're using the outside as a kind of a new hangout spot, public space especially, who is going to get policed for that? Because let's say you're outside having wine or something, some people will be maybe policed more than others in the
for sure
area. So that seems to me a challenge too.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one way of connection, and I see the slide on the screen of the Ai Weiwei, and there are many other artworks at the Forks, including the recent installation by Val Vent with the bison as the new mode of learning, which was installed during COVID. So, by going on these walks, and then, there can be shared experiences, even though you're not all there at the same time. Right. By reminding yourself about the public artworks that are in the city, and then having conversations with people about your experience there. And I urban density. I'm all for it. Infill strategies, 2 meters we can get a lot of people in downtown Winnipeg within respecting that.
Now, in terms of architecture, and I think Lisa already kind of talked about this, like the idea of more sustainable architecture, and certainly, and sustainability can mean a lot of different things, and one of the challenges I think is with COVID is you need things that meet this particular terrible time, but then you don't want to be left with a bunch of things that then don't have a use, maybe a year from now. So there seems to be a lot of, if you look at something like the Javits Center, which was, field hospital, I think it was set up in 4 days or something. You have these kind of a push toward projects that are adaptive and flexible and lightweight and modular and mobile even. So do you want to talk a bit about that? Anybody?
Lawrence?
Sure, I'll just jump in.
Yeah.
Sure. Again, this is maybe an example of an acceleration of something that was kind of already underway. And it's not actually that new an idea, because a lot of those early modern architecture were about mobile space, shifting things around, the building changing form and so on. And that's an idea that has come back from the 1960s and various times. And we have we have here in Winnipeg, one of actually the world's, perhaps not too much of an exaggeration to say that one of the world's best examples of pop-up architecture, which is the Winnipeg warming huts, right? So architecture which is ephemeral and pops up to serve a certain purpose is not a new idea, but it is something that is of service in these sorts of conditions. And not just architecture, but also in terms of product design. So rather, when your supply lines are kind of messed up and you can't get ventilators, people are inventively coming up with ways of designing, finding ways to get information online on how to throw together a sort of 3D printed ventilator, just for example, that distributed manufacturing. So there's kind of a decentralization of the manufacturing process that's possible. And that's not something that's new, but something that's sort of maybe accelerated by the demands of COVID and can meet, the needs that you're talking about.
Yeah. And I think there are one or two slides with the pop-up the treatment center or the Javits Center, and but an interesting example of a pop-up situation in Winnipeg is, of course, the pop-up toilet initiative led by Bridgman Collaborative, which was an idea kicking around for many years, and then there was the 2018 trial run of that, and the last I saw on the Free Press is that the city seems to be getting behind that, so that there's a pop-up idea. I don't know if you can call like a 10-year project a pop-up, but it pops up and then it catches on. So I think that's a great example of showing how we need to keep having pop-up ideas as trial runs, because then they are ready and at hand to respond to situations. So and that project, of course, is now all the more important, not just as a public toilet facility, but also as an accessible place for the public to wash their hands, right? Because public hygiene is now, we're all affected by that. I think as I always like to throw in caveats, we also, there's also pop-up bars and temporary patios, and that's fabulous that those were able to be accommodated. But sometimes we have to think, well, who's benefiting from these pop-up environments? Who are the customers? I'm sure they're all good customers. I'm an occasional customer, but are they in service of the broad community, or are they a kind of leisure item? Certainly the toilet project is not that. That's serving a very broad public. But I've also read articles about how there's so much enthusiasm for certain pop-up ideas that suddenly the community is saying, hey, wait a second, we weren't consulted on whether we really want that here, and now it's going to stay. But again, this is not in relation to the pop-up toilet example, which is on the screen right now, but others. So public consultation still needs to be going on, and I'd say that's actually a challenge for cities and also for architects and artists who are, how do we keep the consultations going?
Yes, actually, consultation is always crucial. And this is something else that might also require a lot of consultation is we might, as our ways of working, I think, are going to change substantially, and also our ways of shopping, consuming, are going to change. Like malls were already under threat, department stores are pretty much gone. And so we're going to have a lot of massive infrastructure that might not suit its original purpose. So will there be a way, like, to find creative ways to adaptively reuse some of these? Lawrence,
Oh, for sure. We just had a student who did her thesis project on that.
Oh, okay. Lisa, then, do you want to?
Oh, it's just an anecdote just regarding what to do with the malls.
Right.
There have been people thinking about ways to reappropriate them for other purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And a thesis
Yeah.
student, Thea Watson, this year proposed housing
Yeah.
and
Okay.
marketplaces. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, I think that will really come up going forward. And Lawrence, you were talking about moving things onto the streets, things that and taking over more streets, maybe downtown.
Sure. I mean, that's something that happens in the summer anyway. People move out onto the patios, but now if you want to be in a restaurant, if a restaurant wants to have any number of customers, they need more space. And where can they get that? The only option really is out on the street. It's back to the idea of getting out there in public space.
Yeah. Okay.
And the outdoor market and outdoor seating at the Forks right now is super successful. They've expanded the outdoor seating from previous summers, and a lot of people are taking advantage of that, going inside to get takeout and then moving outside.
Right.
Sure.
Of course, the fact that we are a winter city, that might pose some real challenges going forward, I think. But can you think of anything coming to mind here?
It does, but I'll come back to that idea in a second. On the screen right now, you see an example of John Hirsch Way, which is just behind the MTC, and a little fragment of the East Exchange District, which was designed by HTFC, a landscape firm, and with the support of the city of Winnipeg, of course. As a way of creating an environment, or testing the possibilities of an environment where cars and people can coexist together. I was mentioning walking down, all those people walking down Wolseley and other streets in Winnipeg now, why can we not have this all the time? In Holland, they actually, several decades ago, came up with the concept of the Wooner for the living street, which is a street where cars, now this doesn't work on a highway obviously, but where cars and pedestrians inhabit the same space without a rigid separation between them. And the idea is it gets rid of the clutter of a whole bunch of signs, and it gets rid of the cars feeling that they can drive through at any speed, and it actually decreases the amount of accidents that happen. In Winnipeg, we have an example, speaking of winter cities, that may almost have gone out of style at the moment. But when I was growing up here in the 70s, people would play hockey in the back lanes. That was a living street space. Yeah. So you'd play out there, and when a car came along, people would yell, "Car!" and haul the equipment out of there. So there was a coexistence, and they're in the middle of winter between pedestrians and cars. So I don't think we should be afraid of winter. I think that winter has...
No, we have to embrace
Look at the number of people who enjoy the Forks midwinter, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Gosh, that calling car, that reminds me of my own older brother playing hockey outside of our street. This is north of Toronto. Yeah, funny.
Yeah. So now, how do you think offices are going to respond?
They already have.
Yes, they already have. And certainly there was already a move to some people having hybrid jobs where they work partly at home, partly at the office, but there is going to be a shift. So how do you think that will function in terms of...
I think employers, and the more institutional employers especially, are starting to insist on a redesign of interior space, to avoid people, just like in the supermarket, you walk down this aisle that way and the other aisle the other way. That was, I think that's a change that is going to be underway. I can speak from personal experience. My spouse works for the federal government. They're not going back into the office until things are rearranged, so that will happen. And more people are going to work at home.
Yeah. Okay. And so the total open office plan, will that disappear, or will it be even more open? And people will have to
What do you think, Lisa? I would bet on more open.
Okay.
I think it depends, and we're probably going to see as much variation in the future as we have
Yeah.
seen in the past.
Yeah.
So there's probably not one answer. I will say, though, that the latest issue of Canadian Architect includes an exceptional collection of articles written by architects reflecting on this question of how is practice
Yeah.
changed and how has it already been changing. And teamwork was one of the sections in that
Right.
edition. And in some ways, there seems to be a greater trust of the media for these conversations. I think many firms who would normally always fly somewhere for a meeting have now realized, oh, do I really need to fly all the way there just for the
Yeah.
conversation? So they're discovering ways that this can be effective and that can have a great effect on the climate by reducing carbon emissions. Yeah.
Okay. And I saw an article recently, and they were talking about maybe the reconfigured office space that rather than the sort of very desk-based kind of where everyone has an individual desk, that maybe the individual desk would be at home, and that the office would become more of there'd be like almost like hangout spaces where you could have, when you need to kind of really interact and bounce ideas off each other, that people would come in to a large room and do that, but that it would have to be more flexible and sort of adaptable.
Sure. I know that, for example, Republic Architecture, a firm in Winnipeg, I don't think anyone has an assigned desk there. Essentially, it's all hot desking, even the senior partner. So, and this is a model which is not a new thing, actually. The Googleplex, is based on the same idea. Something that was already underway, but is now pushed even further.
Yeah, that's interesting. There was a story in the BBC just the other day about the future office space, and this was the scenario that that you would be going to work only one day a week and schedule all your collaborative meetings on that day. So the office space became a collaborative meeting space, and then you worked at home. But there too, we like, working at home. It's nice if you have a nice home.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
But even if you have a nice home, like some people, that's their sanctuary and their personal life. It's very important to have a space where, okay, that's where you work, and stress might be related to work. And when you come home, that is put aside. So I had someone telling me recently that even to have a single Zoom meeting in his house felt like a violation, like a takeover.
Sure.
I mean, it is a way that kind of colonization of our personal lives, often by our work lives, which some people like and some people hate. And so, let's talk a bit about domestic architecture. And I, first of all, of course, by saying that one of the things that came out of the pandemic is, people are being told to shelter in place. A lot of people don't have shelter, or they don't have adequate shelter or safe shelter. So those are issues. And I think certainly the sort of the inadequacy of sort of affordable housing and social housing is really become a even more glaring problem, if anything, during COVID. But then even for middle class people with, as you say, nice houses that they like, are there going to be ways that people might redesign houses going forward to kind of to deal with the way people will be working in the future, partly, and other things, I guess? What do you think?
I suspect so. I mean, everyone has had challenges with multiple people working at the same time, and where do you work? And even if there are separate bedrooms, sometimes the acoustic separation between those rooms is not sufficient. And then yes, for sure, I think there will be some changes, more adaptability going forward, I hope. But we just have to hope that this adaptability does not become the kind of luxury, right? Because if it's expected of more people, it can't be a luxury item that you have a comfortable place to work. if you're expected to work from home. And go ahead, Lawrence, you probably have something to say.
Well, just to give an example, I had to wander around my house a little bit before I found a place to settle down for this Zoom meeting, right? So we are already starting to create more dedicated spaces for work in the house. But yeah, I agree with what Alison's saying. This is not everybody wants to be having work bleed into their personal life all of the time. In a way, it's a source of freedom, but it's also a source of oppression, I guess you could even say that. Can't get away from it.
And then just the surveillance is a bit, you start thinking about what's on your bookshelf.
That's sure. Yeah.
Like, I noticed you're pretty neutral there, Lawrence. You're
that was not planned. But I like your painting back there, Alison.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
And I know that Lawrence has as many books as me. They're just in his basement, he told me earlier.
So, yeah. Go ahead.
We should talk a bit about very COVID-specific design.
Sure,
like
shall we?
Some of the stuff that's come up to kind of really meet the moment and has had to just be thrown together, either by companies, but also sometimes like just by individuals, by small businesses. And this is the stuff I think that for a lot of people, this is how they're visualizing COVID. It's the signage and, there's this New York, I like the New York subway sign because it's very New York. It's conveying information. It's got a little attitude. It's nice and clear. It gets its point across. But so there's a lot of signs. There's, the physical distancing discs on the ground, the feet, or, ways to help us navigate space. I've been going to restaurants, and I guess worldwide there have been some crazy ways to, enforce, in a sense, physical distancing. Some people had patrons wearing pool noodle hats so that they couldn't brush up against anyone, which other places had mannequins, which is extremely creepy, or blow-up dolls. Terrible idea. On Ellis Avenue had potted plants at every second table. I thought, okay, that's a good solution. But people are finding these kind of interesting design solutions. So yeah, what do you think about that? Like, have you seen things and think,
it's interesting that they're mostly ad hoc.
Yeah,
that these are not permanent solutions. They're just sort of thrown together almost, on the spur of the moment, which leads to some very inventive, like the mannequins, but not. Yeah, I don't know if it qualifies as architecture. I'm not sure.
No, it's more spatial design. I would say.
Sure. Yeah. Wayfinding, perhaps.
Wayfinding, exactly. A lot of duct tape, I noticed. A lot of duct. That's a kind of a Winnipeg thing. A lot of duct tape.
Yeah, and kind of fashion statements where you put yourself in a kind of Jetsons bubble. But of course, architecture is involved in mitigating the transmission of disease very overtly in healthcare design and in microbiology laboratories. And we have two national facilities here in Winnipeg designed by Architecture 49, formerly Smith Carter. So there, of course, it's a very serious business, how to contain the virus, which is being studied. And architecture has a significant role to play in that. So too do protocols and personal protective gear. So yeah, but I guess, we want to hope or find ways that to allow for social distancing, but still for social connection through the generous spaces that can be appropriated for different purposes. And we've already seen a sort of trend towards that, and the adaptability of space. Furniture could be easily moved around. So hopefully we do not need to put, plexiglass partitions in between everything going forward.
Yes, a lot of plexiglass. There's a lot of plexiglass around right now. Absolutely. I see that it is, we've got a few minutes left, so I just want to check if there are any questions coming up. There was a previous question that maybe we could get back to, and someone was asking about the embracing winter question. And this might be a good, maybe you could talk, Lawrence, about, there was the recent competition for temporary visitation kind of units for seniors' homes and long-term care, because people have been visiting outside, which was okay in the summer, but then, yeah, what do you do when if this persists into December? So do you want to talk about that, Laura?
Sure, just really briefly. I mean, we have been very lucky in Manitoba, one, that we have not been hit very hard by COVID-19, but also especially that our senior citizens in personal care homes have not been, which is not to say it couldn't happen, but there are parts of Canada and parts of the world where it has just been a devastating effect. However, as part of keeping them safe, people in personal care homes have been cut off from their relatives. You can go and look at, grandma through the window. That's about it. So there was a call for expressions of interest recently, sponsored by the provincial government, for structures for visiting, where you can go and visit people in personal care homes in the wintertime, which is a real, a challenge. So our firm and another number of other firms put together proposals for how you could imagine that. What sort of pods would you have on the outside of buildings of the personal care homes in order to allow a space, which is sort of between that safe space inside and the public world. So yeah, there are a number of we see a lot of shipping containers actually in the designs for this kind of thing, which is again an example of ad hoc architecture, right? Throwing something together from an already existing part. I think that the plan is to have some of those popping up over the next winter. But of course, the real concern is architecture is always also about people, right? So the real concern is how are we taking care of those folks in those homes, not just a matter of a design solution.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lisa.
And I think, Lisa, you had sent a link that was really about this is the perfect time to radically rethink how people live in long-term care and to go away from that kind of hospital model to something more humane.
Yeah, more household based. And that's right. The article I sent was written by Rudy Friesen, a retired architect from FT3 here in Winnipeg, who do a number of designs for long-term care facilities based on a household model. So that household model, instead of having, the long corridor, instead of taking the kind of hospital institution as the model for long care facilities, to take the household. So you might group, 8 to 12 rooms around a common living room, and then have several clusters of those, or a few clusters. But with that it's not just the architecture. You could have the perfect architecture, but the care philosophy needs to go together with the architecture. So you really need both.
Well, and that's a good example, I think, of something where architecture and design responding to COVID could lead, because if you had this kind of household model, people would be perhaps less isolated. They're not just in their rooms along the corridor. Those kind of people, I think we refer to them as corridors, which is, but that it would be a better design for COVID to respond to COVID, but it would be a better design going into the future for all sorts of reasons.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of, as you said, that the solutions that come out of this have to be good solutions for the right reasons that will stay that way, going
That's
forward.
right. So if you just take like $30,000 and throw it towards one long-term care facility, that might not be what they need to address the issues there. And yeah, isolation is a mode of treatment. And of course, there are isolation rooms. And one of the things that's being proposed for long-term care facilities is to designate a room where if someone does have
Yes.
COVID, you put them in the room. Well,
Yes.
gosh, like, so why not look at the whole facility and make sure that it's a caring facility to begin with,
Mhm.
so we don't have further the isolation. That might
Yes.
not be the best investment. Yeah.
Right.
Alison, can I throw out a question? I know we're
Yeah.
coming up to the end of our time. We've talked about design of space. We've talked
Mhm.
about design of practice also. I have a question for Lisa about how all of this is impacting the training of architects.
Oh,
Because
yes.
a
Yeah.
very important part of architectural, interior design, landscape architecture, city planning training is working with other people in the same space in a studio environment.
Mhm.
How
Yeah,
does that work now?
Yeah.
yeah, of course. Well, we'll make it work. It'll be challenging. And there's an image there. I think it might be the last slide of how that went at the end of the term. I mean, I think many of us agree that the turn to online teaching at the end worked out better than we might have expected.
Mm,
And that's Ritam there on the left showing me his model. The model, of course, was made pre-COVID, but that had been what we had oriented our conversations around for the previous week. So he brought it to his room, and that oriented the conversation to come. So, there are, for sure, there's impacts. And this fall will be a challenge for all of us who are teaching
mm,
in the design fields across the world. When COVID hit in March, the students already had projects well underway. The end of
yeah.
term was in
Yeah.
sight. So it was really
Okay.
about wrapping things up,
Mhm.
preparing presentation drawings. And a lot
Yeah.
of those last weeks of Design Studio do turn to the focus online anyway for the presentation
Mhm.
aspects. So we got by, and in a strange way, there were some benefits. And the thesis presentations on the right there, we discovered that we could invite critics who were far away. We didn't have to pay for their flight.
Right.
They could
Yeah. I
tune
mean,
in.
that's, yeah.
And the chat was kind of alive with other students offering encouragement, popping up a little question. So there was a nice way of interaction, which sometimes the review itself doesn't always allow that. So,
Okay.
but at the same time, enormously challenging for the students in particular.
Mm,
The
Mhm.
end of term, anxiety over summer work,
sure.
living situations,
Yeah.
family situations,
Yeah.
Yeah.
international students.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So we hope that we can keep it going. Interestingly, in the UK, RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, they did a survey with all of the architecture students. Something like 800 students responded to the survey, and the number one concern was that the students would not be able to casually see the other students' work.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right?
It's such a big part of the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This kind of vicarious learning, and I
Yeah.
suspect many people in offices
Mhm,
are also missing that.
Yes. Yes.
mhm, mhm.
That's a good point. Um, well, I guess we've reached our hour, so I want to thank you both, Lisa and Lawrence,
Our
for
pleasure.
all your insight, and thanks, Colby, for your support, and thank you, First Friday. I do want to remind people, whenever or however you're listening to this, that even though we're not in the exchange right now, that the exchange is still there, and that artists and studios and galleries and businesses are finding ways to adapt, and so please, do check out the First Friday's webpage, and you'll find that there is some programming going on, even if it's maybe a little different from the way it was before. And I mean, I guess maybe that sums up our current predicament. We're adapting and going forward, and hopefully we're optimistic about it. So thank you very much.
Thanks,
And
Alison. Our pleasure.
Thank you, Alison.
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.